It's really great to be here to perform for you also. It was very interesting to be approached to do specifically this one, since every talk obviously has a topic. So it made me think about, the lyrics and certain songs that I have and what I thought would fit. And I have a song called Ophelia that I'm going to perform for you now. And I wrote it on the day of the storm, hence the title. But at its core, it's about kind of trusting your gut and not letting moments pass that you might fear, whether it be a small little obstacle or a big one, and just to think about the little victories that we have every day. So I hope you like it. I lay down on the grass and look up as the clouds move left to right. I am so overwhelmed by the beauty of it all, but suddenly I get a fright as a boy runs by me down the road, trying to catch a girl just in time. They were separated once before in the past, but this time he's read the sign. Seal delivered, I'm yours, plays on the air as she waves the trees goodbye. Branches wrap around the lonely bricks and stones, for her warmth they do pine. Ooh, ooh. How's the wind as she drives by? And that house has been through wars, but adores all the decorations it gets. And it is haunted by the ghost of a man now, full of regrets. So I ask you now just to breathe and vow that you will not waste your time second guessing yourself, fear the cards you've been dealt and letting chances pass you by. And when that moment comes, will you stay or run from yourself because it's too hard? Or will you be brave, countless hours you'll save, and that huge weight will be gone? How's the wind as she looks on? I lay down on the grass and look up as the clouds move left to right. I am so overwhelmed by the thought of it all that on my tongue I do bite.
It's nice actually starting the music. It makes you quite raw and emotional, which I always feel is a good way to approach these things. But in the kind of week or two after Aidan had asked me to send in the bio I went through, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, that kind of throws into crisis of, oh, I can't believe I said that. Oh my gosh, I can't believe that I mentioned this thing from 7 years ago. And the pretty underlying fear that it all was pretty obnoxious. And talking to various friends about this, the only thing that ever really makes me feel better is realizing that essentially whenever we say anything about ourselves, it is always a made-up story. And that actually, admitting that and owning it, then we have a certain power. Doing research for my history degree last year, I came across this quote which encapsulates a lot about how I feel about the world, which was, judge this work of art not in the first place on its physique, but on its imaginative scope. And saying, so what we intend to do, what we try to do, is much more important than the surface prettiness of something. And for me, this sense of imagination and fantasy really lies at what has always kind of captivated me. And I take this back to childhood. My two formative influences were fashion and Harry Potter, which recently, thankfully, have merged in the phenomenal Instagram account Griffin Dior, where members of Gryffindor are photoshopped into the Dior collections. There's also guest houses. So there's Yves Slytherant, one of my favorites, and Chanel Elf, which we will get to later. And these two things for me, it is that sense of imagination and fantasy allowing you to have control over the world that you live in. So when I was 16 then, these kind of interests crystallized into two main things. First, with fashion, I took a year off school, and I went and did work experience with different fashion designers. I was with Vivienne Westwood in London, Roxane de Linchick, and Jean Rocha here in Dublin. And then returning to school, I also started debating. So people may not be aware, but Harry Potter is actually a huge, really important political work as well. It's largely based on 30s Europe and is kind of analogous for fascism, essentially. So Voldemort's obviously Hitler. And so my interest in debating came from trying to understand the political framework in which we were living and the world, and trying to find a way of discussing it as well that allowed me to be creative and say something interesting and be free from the strictures of school. I'll get back actually. So, and the thing with this was it sounds really impressive and it was really fun and I had a great time doing it. But I went back into school and put an incredible amount of pressure on myself, feeling like I needed to succeed so much to be able to go off and live this life and to access this amazing fantasy world. And motivation is great, but throwing up in the bushes before your Spanish exam from anxiety isn't great. And this persisted for a few years. And then my second year of college, I had, if we talk about intention, there are certain things that no amount of intention can overcome. So within about 4 months, I had 2 family deaths, and then was in a relationship that had kind of a massive crisis in it. And the best quote I've ever heard of describing what that period of time felt like was Zoe Chase discussing, also in her early 20s after her dad died, that her thoughts felt like molasses. My family, the situation was very complicated, so there was a huge knock-on effects, affected all areas of my personal life, and essentially throughout any intention that I had had, any idea to succeed and stay focused and kill myself with pressure, just wasn't going to happen. It wasn't going to function. And so I trudged through that year in college, and then and then by complete chance, Simone Rocha booked me to start working as her fittings model. So I was in-house model for Don and Simone Rocha for that season. And someone noticed around the time, said to me that fashion was the only thing that gave me any kind of joy or made me any way happy. So I ended up going off and doing their shows in London Fashion Week and then doing Simone's showroom in Paris. So this is her studio in London, where I see our fashion book, which is Corinne Rothfield's magazine. She's former editor of French Vogue. They came. So this is nice because you can see kind of the studio set up, and even the blurry photos on the wall are like from fittings before when I had a French plaid in, so then they were using that as a reference doing the face. So I got to see like the innermost workings of what they were doing, and they were incredibly generous, involved me in asking how I felt about things. It was a really amazing process. But the thing with you when you go off to a fantasy world, much like when Harry goes off and you realize that you're not a freak that needs to be hidden in a cupboard under the stairs, that actually there are people like you, and there's a huge relief to that. But you also realize that this world isn't perfect. There's a dark overlord, and they're really racist to house elves. So the analogy here is a little bit sketchy, but I think it works something along the lines of the fact that house elves aren't allowed to own clothes, and when you're a model, you're wearing clothes that other people put on you. So I think there's something there. I'm not quite sure what it is. So for me, what was really interesting is having this amazing experience, seeing this kind of talent and creativity, and enjoying the kind of skill, the performance that modeling allowed, but feeling how restricted it was, and the lack of agency or power that I had in it. Because when you're a model, you have no control over what you do. You have no control, essentially, a lot of the time over who you work with. And often that means that your willpower is expendable. It means you're not treated as fully human often. And it leads to, as I'm sure many people are aware, especially in the recent year with Me Too, a huge amount of abuse in the industry. And the main thing for me as well was actually having that control over what I was doing. So it was funny then coming back to college after that. Lauren Henshaw, who was in my course, messaged me and asked if I'd be interested in starting a fashion magazine in college. And again, I'm convinced that one of the reasons that, from 4 years ago that I'm still doing that is because it wasn't something that was tied to this grand idea of success and what I thought was this really shiny, impressive thing to do, but was something that was just fun and interesting, and we were just doing it for its own sake, for something to kind of, fill up this difficult time. And neither of us had any experience with writing articles or producing shoots or any of that. So we really sat down and went from first principles. We have these experiences of fashion. This is the thing that we love more than anything, and we don't see that reflected in the media that we're interacting with. We don't feel there's a space for, as someone put it to me recently in a recent podcast interview recorded, looking for something that reflected your mental landscape. And we couldn't find that. So we figured out how we could capture that. So we start each issue of the print publication with a theme. So this was our issue 3. And then we source contributors, mostly on the basis of, I will admit, interesting things people have said over drinks. And then I will try and convince them into writing it up into an article, which is usually a very long process. We go back and forth. People have cried about their relationships with their mother, which I'm always quite proud of having brought about. And we produce these articles then and fashion editorials that what makes me happy is people go back and they reread them. And people will come back 2 or 3 years later and say they read it again and they were thinking about it in this way. So these are things that we wanted to offer something that was different from the way when people are under so much pressure, churning things out, and we wanted to take a step back from that and allow people time to really develop it and to push forward. So when someone starts working with us on a piece, what they come out with at the end is completely different. Or not completely different, but isn't it something that we really develop with them? We want to take them and their idea to a new place, and we want then people reading it to be brought to a new place by each thing that they engage with. And we do these fashion editorials, which we produce kind of like a film. We kind of like get a whole team together and spend a day and give it loads of space and develop kind of characters and everything. And then this is one of the articles. So then after this year and a half out from college, I decided to go. I decided I was going to return, to the annoyance of my tutor after the deadline to tell them that I was returning. And I was very clear that if I was going back to college, I was going to do it with a reason and for a purpose. And I said I wanted to have an area that I was an expert in. There's something that I knew about. I wanted to have something that I was taking away from that experience. This is editorial that we shot in the issues that you will have, which was in the Berkeley Library in Trinity, which is a beautiful British building which celebrated its 50th anniversary last year. So we got 2 documentary photographers from the north, came down and shot this amazing editorial, which was a really amazing way to kind of finish my time in college. And I love that cardigan. So over my time in college, there were 2 big things that I really kind of took out of it. So the first is that I really wanted to define what fashion is. Academically, fashion is given very little attention, and often the way that we discuss fashion is very product-focused, and it wasn't something I felt I had encountered a good answer to. So studying Walker Evans, who's a documentary photographer in the 1930s, this image of his actually was one of the references to Alexander Lieberman, who was the creative director of American Vogue at the time, and really had a huge role in Condé Nast and developing that publishing empire. It's a kind of brand and image, said that this is the ultimate fashion photograph, because this is essentially, while a documentary image, a photograph about style. And what was interesting about Walker Evans is he was incredibly anti-commercialism and hated fashion and the associated industries. But this is a feature of his from 1955 in Fortune magazine, where he photographed tools with amazing studio conditions, proper backdrops, lighting, and actually it's hard to see, but at the bottom there's actually captions of them stating the price and where they're bought, much like you would in a fashion editorial. And unpublished text that went with this said that men with their suburban lives, like looking at the windows of these tools, imagining this kind of more rustic existence and this sense of fantasy and escape. And essentially, to me, it was going, okay, this is saying that these items, what fashion is about the social meaning of items, but also our emotional experiences of them. And then the second thing was my dissertation, which I did on Lee Miller. So Lee Miller was scouted by Condé Nast in her early 20s and started modeling for Vogue. She then became a fashion photographer, and she actually ended up being accredited with the US Army and being Vogue's war correspondent. What I found interesting studying her is that I was largely filled with feminist rage during the process. So the scholarship on her tends to go, here was this fashion photographer, and then the war came along, and she came and started reporting on the war, and she realized what was really important. She got her shit together. And what was interesting is she was one of the kind of pivotal members of the Surrealist movement, which was an incredibly political, artistic movement. And actually, her reporting on the war was a critique of taste. It was something that was very much fashion reporting and fashion photography. And I think my favorite example of this is her reporting on Hitler's apartment. She also visited his house in Bavaria. She's actually one of the first on the scene, and it was exclusive images of it before it was burnt by the Russians. And I have the exact quote, because when somebody is writing in Vogue bitching about someone's taste, you really need to quote it properly. So describing, this was actually Eva Braun's house, so Hitler's mistress. She said everything in it was strictly department store, like everything in the Nazi regime. It was impersonal and in good, average, slightly artistic taste. And what's interesting from a surrealist point of view is it was this sacrifice of imagination and creativity for good taste, for as things were supposed to be. And she equated this to the nature of the Nazi regime, because the sense of inhumanity, of sacrificing what makes us human, that capacity for imagination and creativity. And she thought you could see that in their furniture. And I'd also just like to point out that the interiors of both Hitler and Eva Braun's house are actually incredibly similar to that of the Dursleys. So there's absolutely, I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with Eichmann and the Holocaust, Angela Rendit's work on the banality of evil, discussing World War II. And I think essentially Miller was making a case for the banality of taste, which absolutely defines the Dursleys in both senses, both evil and taste. And then so halfway through that year, a friend told me, she asked what I wanted to do after college, and I said that I wanted to develop the magazine into a business. And she told me that I should apply to Launchbox, which is Trinity College's accelerator program for student-founded companies. My response to this was, no, that's that blue thing for computer people. I don't think it's for me. And going into the startup world was quite a leap for a creative project that was also print-based, which just freaks everybody out immensely, despite the fact that the majority or a huge amount of consumer-focused startups actually have launched print magazines, despite, while getting like tens of millions of VC funding. But, it's a women thing, so it kind of wigs everyone out a little bit, tends to be the theme. So one of the things that's interesting about the startup world is it seems so serious by comparison to fashion, because this is business, and there's loads of money involved, and people are forging a new future. But I think, for me, one of the best quotes I've heard on it was, I think it was Chris Maud, a journalist who'd written a lot about the startup world, that he'd actually worked at Flipboard while they were acquired at 100 million in funding, and he said, when you tell the story that secures you 100 million in funding, you are pulling from Greek mythology. So if you want the pinnacle, I think, of our generation's fantasy and storytelling, it is absolutely in the startup world. And it was an incredibly interesting and challenging experience to spend some time in that environment. But it was an incredibly valuable experience for us, and we gained a huge amount of it. So we from it. So we secured some international stockists. So we're now sold in phenomenal magazine stores in London and New York. We got a terrific range of mentors, former CEO of Newsweek, Deirdre Tracy, who manages Trinity's endowment, and we launched our e-commerce, and we started developing digital content as well. But the real thing was that it allowed us to plan what actually I could build the magazine into, and knowing that it was something that was much more about the magazine, but it was about the space that we wanted the magazine to create. And so I love this quote from Sartre in Vogue, that he, in his article in Vogue in 1945, the idea that realism destroys the very idea of humanity, for it is a submission to things. And I think we're living in a culture when the pinnacle of our storytelling is around business, where we're so focused on optimization and efficiency that there's a real cost to that, and that we're then subject to the rules of efficiency and the rules of optimization, and that luxury essentially allows us a space for that freedom to do something that is nonsensical, that is, surreal, or it is even in just the fact that, like, it was too expensive a jacket, and to give ourselves that joy, that opportunity for pleasure, and ultimately what we are working on is finding a way of doing that that is, that kind of, I think a lot of it is because the way that luxury has worked has been aspirational and hierarchical, and it's been dictating to you the way you should live your life. And I think we know instinctively we don't actually enjoy it. That feels quite unpleasant to be told that you need to acquire these things to live this lifestyle. So it's about trying to find a way of doing that actually brings us those benefits and advantages. I couldn't find a photo of me pitching, so this is me talking at the launch event. I thought everyone could pretend. So this was slightly missed. But this is just running through then. So over that phase, things that have kind of come from it. So from getting international stockists, it really excites me that we see a lot on Instagram, kind of readers across the world. This is somebody in London. People, spend ages constructing these beautiful photos of the magazine, which is super cool. And then we actually also, this March, launched a partnership with Bank of Ireland, so they're giving us business support, and we're working with them on a couple of projects, which is really exciting. And then, this is the podcast that we launched earlier last month, which is a series of conversations on topics. We bring in guests. So we've talked about kind of how we see fashion and what that is with Anna Cosgrave from Repeal. We've talked about one of the librarians from Trinity about the design legacy of the Berkeley. Our coming episode, which I'm really excited for, is about the post-digital fashion fantasy, and is about kind of meme culture and fashion on the internet. So all of these things are really cool, and it's been so much fun, and it's really exciting. But also it feels like often failure for so much of it. The ideas of all the things that I wanted to do in the last year, so few of those I've been able to do. And so I love this image of Lee Miller taken by her husband in 1946 after the war. She really didn't work very much after the war and kind of retreated to their house in the country, where they often hosted their surrealist friends. And I think it's very interesting that there is a real veneration of these things, and they are so fun, and they are so exciting, and they do bring us so much joy. But I think the cost as well sometimes, and what you really are learning throughout that process, are often really painful lessons. And I think, for me, the real insight or the real battle has been learning how to have that sense of purpose and to be very clear on what my intention is, and then to learn basically the tools to realize that. So things like treating advice from people as a tool that helps me, not it's going to guide what I'm supposed to do. And if it's not useful, I'm not really interested in hearing it. Realizing things that like sleeping is actually brilliant. And you should, you should try and do as much of it as you can. That actually taking holidays isn't an insane indulgence, kind of indicative of some rotten soul, but it's quite a normal human thing to do. I have a little bit of that kind of Russian peasant attitude, where like hard work and exhaustion, I think, is good for the soul. And I think ultimately one of the things about this is it is that sense of feeling like if you work harder, if you try more, you'll get there, you'll be good enough, and finally it'll all fall into place, and you'll be off in Hogwarts or walking for Dior or whatever. But then what happens when you get there? Because I think sometimes we can hand over power for our lives or for what we want to something external to us. And ultimately, I think when we enjoy fantasy, when we enjoy the power to make up our own stories, we can live a much more pleasant life. So yeah, everybody has a copy of the most recent issue of the magazine. Our next one will be coming in September, I'm hoping, although, you know, there's this as well. So, I mean, I like to keep it vague. And thank you all so much for coming. It's been amazing. And I've always wanted to be like Oprah, so it's amazing to hand out one to every member of the audience. Thank you. Yeah.